This is The Civil Fleet, the podcast focused on activist-led refugee rescue and support missions across Fortress Europe, with me, Ben Coles. In today's episode, we speak with migrant rights campaigner and policy expert Zoe Gardener about the UK's illegal immigration bill. Zoe is going to tell us how the government plans to reject the asylum applications of anyone who enters the country irregularly, including victims of trafficking and slavery, and how it plans to house them in old military bases and deport them to a third country. It is crazy stuff. So before we get into today's episode, I'd like to remind you that the Civil Fleet is not just a podcast, but also a blog with news stories, interviews and investigations. So if you'd like to find out more, go to civilfleet.com. Also, if you like what the Civil Fleet is doing and you would like to help us to continue this podcast or to cover some of the costs of running it and to help us to continue to platform activists and experts and journalists and refugees and all the people that we've had on here, then you can support us with a donation, a small one if you like, or an absolutely massive one if you can. You can go to ko-fi.com/civilfleet to donate a bit of money if you like. That's ko-fi.com/civilfleet. Or you can give the podcast a rating, share it around if you like, write a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you can do that kind of thing. That would really help as well. Anyway, I think that's all the stuff I've got to say. Oh yes, it's been a while since I last did an episode. I think it's been about a month. I'd like to get 2 episodes out a month, but I can't always do that. This month's been quite a busy month for me. I was learning to drive. I passed my driving test, get in, and I'm lucky enough to be going on holiday at the end of this week. So the next episode will be out next month. Right, let's get on with the show, and I'll see you again in May. Cheers. Okay, so shall we get started, Zoe?
Mm-hmm.
Zoe Gardener, thank you so much for coming on the Civil Fleet podcast.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
It's really good to get you on, someone I've wanted to get on the podcast for a while. So it's really nice to see you and to get you on the podcast. Obviously, people listening can't see you, but I can. Anyway, we were just talking before we started recording of how to refer to you. You are an independent campaigner, a migrant rights campaigner, a researcher and policy expert in this kind of thing. Is that right?
That's about right, yeah. No fixed title, but something along those lines will do.
And could you, before we get started, we've got you on today to talk about the illegal migration bill and the current situation and what's happening to migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, etc., people on the move that are coming to Britain or in Britain. But before we get into all of that, could you tell us a kind of a brief bit about yourself and how you ended up doing what you do?
Sure, yeah. So I'm a Londoner with a sort of mixed mongrel European background. And I've been working on migration rights and refugee rights in some form or another ever since I started working. Basically, I got into this issue while I was still at uni. I took a few classes. I was doing a master's on international politics, and I took a few classes about migration policy, and I suddenly realised that this was the most important thing in the world. I had one of those light bulb moments that I don't think many people get, but I really did. I went out that day from that class and I signed up to my university's Student Action for Refugees group, started volunteering, doing some English language classes for recently arrived asylum seekers through that, and just carried on straight out of uni. Got a really great opportunity to do a paid internship with the European Council on Refugees and Exiles, which is based in Brussels. So that was obviously focusing on policy at the EU level. And then I came back to the UK and I've worked for a bunch of different civil society organisations and done some independent research as well, always focused on this issue of migrants' rights and the rights of people, as you say, people who move, which are so maligned in this country. And unfortunately, I've been facing a sort of tide of political sort of action in the wrong direction ever since I've been working on this. But I do feel like at the same time as we've seen this huge regression in terms of the political conversation and the rights of migrants and refugees. We've also seen a change in the general population's attitudes that has been much more positive. And I try to sort of keep hope by knowing that actually when I speak up about these issues, I'm speaking for millions and millions of decent people in the country who actually want to treat people more decently.
Yeah, I think it's important to know, like what you're saying, it's important to that you're speaking not just for yourselves and activists and stuff, but so many people in Britain also find what's happening here to be abhorrent, and they want a change, but you don't always get those voices. Or I think it can feel, particularly if you're in the media, like you're the outside weirdo saying, like completely crazy things when a lot of people support these positions, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think one of the most important things I can do is to try to push back against that Overton window. Like, the conversation we're having now in the media and in politics is so far to the right and so much more hostile towards migrants and refugees than we would have thought was possible or tolerable 10 years ago. And so I think that it's really important that people are brave enough to sort of speak out and reframe the conversation on one about like what we could do differently and how we can actually treat people with dignity. And the UK could be a safe haven for many, many more refugees. And we don't always have to fit our demands and our conversation into the tiny pinhead of space that is given to us as the supposedly respectable position on migration. I think we need to push back against it really hard.
And actually, Britain has like a long history of accepting refugees. It has quite a long history of rejecting people as well, but it had a history of accepting people, right? So yeah, it's a good thing to do, and it's I'm glad there's someone like you doing this and speaking this kind of thing. At the moment, you're independent and you're working. You after quite often in the media talking about these kind of things as well, right? I think I've seen you being interviewed on the BBC and stuff. And how does that generally go? How do you find that stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, one of the reasons why I'm so glad to be here today chatting with you, Ben, is that I think that podcasts and, there are some alternative forms of media that really give a much more, a more positive space to have a more in-depth conversation. A lot of the time when I'm speaking in the media, I'm given like 30 seconds. I'm set up against, this. Usually it's somebody who was in some way involved with UKIP at some point or whatever, some sort of nobody right-wing shock jock media personality who's there to say, something horrible, and then I've got 30 seconds, okay, Zoe, respond to that. And it's totally unedifying for the viewer, like it's presented as like, there's two sides and we must probably, as the reasonable person, fall somewhere in the middle or something. It doesn't get us anywhere, because the reality is that this is a very complex issue. Migration impacts, so many different parts of our world and our country and our economy and the systems that we all live within, our care system, our NHS, our food production systems. All of these things are impacted by migration, and the stories of people who migrate are so diverse and so complex. Every single one of them is a full human being, and it's very difficult to get across the real issues and the real solutions and the real humanity of the issue when you're given a sort of 5-second soundbite to deliver the message, or you're done. And also that the conversation in the press is always so reactive. So the government makes an announcement, they put out a press release, and then I'll be challenged like, okay, the government says this, what do you say? And really what the government then gets to do is lead the agenda and lead the conversation on migration entirely, when, what we should be looking at is all of their failures and how their systems have been designed over time to produce an outcome that is unacceptable and that is failing people both in our communities and failing migrants and refugees. But if we're just constantly reactive, then again, we're not able to have the conversations that we really need to have in order to push this forward and into a better policy position.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I really hope that's something that this podcast does. And, I try to platform people with different opinions than what you hear often in the media. I really agree with that. And speaking of failures and the government failures and what's happening, let's talk about the current situation. We're going to talk about the illegal migration bill, which I think is currently in Parliament. It's about to go. It's in a review phase, or it's going to the third reading or something. So before we talk about that, I don't know how to ask this question really. I guess could you kind of sum up situation? I mean, that's a huge question. Maybe let's start with the 2022 Nationality and Borders Act. Like, what happened there? And people who follow the civil fleet or listen to the podcast, they might have heard about the Rwanda scheme and all that kind of stuff. Could you kind of sum up where we are at the moment? I know that's a huge question.
It is. I'll do my best. Yeah, so I think Brexit sort of was a defining moment for changing the conversation and shifting it towards one that was more overtly hostile towards migrants and refugees. And I think it also has had an impact on shifting some of the routes that are reasonable for refugees to take to come to the UK. And so what's been building up over the last several years has been an increase in visibility of irregular migration into the UK, specifically through these crossings of the Channel on small boats and dinghies. The numbers have actually gone up in the last couple of years as well, but overall the numbers didn't go up so much so as the route changed to this incredibly visible and sort of media friendly in a sick way boat crossing system. And that provoked an enormous, well, I don't know whether it's right to say it provoked or whether it was taken as an opportunity to create an enormous furore. I never know how to pronounce that word. Fury in the media, pandemonium and chaos in the media, pointing at these boats and saying something must be done, something must be done, something must be done. And the government's reaction to that, and at the time it was a government led by Boris Johnson and with Priti Patel leading the Home Office as Home Secretary, they brought out this, as you say, the Nationality and Borders Act, which passed into law just a year ago. It's a really, really recent history we're talking about. And that was aimed, that was what they said was going to end the small boats crossings, was going to solve the whole issue. Spoiler alert, it didn't. But how it aimed to do that was to severely curtail the right of somebody who had made that one of those crossings irregularly to the UK to seek asylum. And it introduced the prospect of being able to send somebody to a third country, that's the term. So it means not the country they've come from and not the country they're in, but a third country, another country that they have probably no connection to whatsoever, in order for, before we had processed their asylum claim. So that was a big departure. Because usually under the law of this country and under international law, if somebody comes here, regardless of how they travel here, if they say they're an asylum seeker, that they're fleeing persecution, we have to examine that claim. We have to give them a fair hearing, and we have to establish whether under the grounds of the Refugee Convention they are in fact fleeing persecution. And if they are, we should offer them protection. So what that bill did, that act now did, was it said that we won't do that if they've come irregularly. We'll try to send them somewhere else, and we'll give ourselves 6 months in which to do that. And that was obviously when the Rwanda plan was announced, and that was a deal that we made with the Rwandan government that would be the destination where we would be able to send people without, people who had come here asking for our help. We weren't going to examine their claim. We would just send them to Rwanda.
This is the third country you were talking about, right? This is the third place, yeah.
And so the sort of justification for that is that the third country could also be safe, because we're talking about people who cannot be returned to their country of origin because their country of origin is unsafe. And that's the basis of refugee protection, which is that if somebody's fleeing danger, you can't send them back to where they came from. So this new sort of introduction of a third place where you could send them is what the Rwanda plan is about. We essentially have taken one of the poorest countries in the world with a really horrific human rights record, a dictatorship, not a democratic country, not a country with a free press, not a country with basic civil liberties defended, not a country where it's safe to be gay, for example. And a very small country, and as I say, a very poor country, and we have essentially bribed that country with our superior economic and political might to say that they will take in refugees. Obviously, this means that government can say, we have the prestige, we are helping the UK with their refugee problem. It makes that government be able to sort of look good to a certain audience as well at home. So it's a really dirty deal of nasty politics going on here. And the purpose was said to be that it would be about removing people from the UK, and washing our hands of responsibility for refugees seeking protection here. I'm aware that I'm rambling, but yeah, I can explain sort of it hasn't happened, thankfully. I think most decent people, well, all decent people in this country think that that's an abhorrent idea, that we shouldn't be washing our hands of responsibility for refugees, and that we should simply be taking care of their claims ourselves.
There's also, like you said, there's been a huge backlash, right? There was campaigns against it. People, I think they were lying in front of vans to stop people being taken to the whichever airport they were being deported from. And there's been some brilliant reporting, which I'll link in the show notes, of what was happening to the people that were about to be deported on one of the flights. And I think it was Privilege something was the airline.
Privilege Style.
That's it, Privilege Style. That was involved in that kind of thing, right? So yeah, it's been quite a backlash to it, and not just from like activist left. It's been like, from centrists, and also even conservatives have opposed it, right?
Yeah, and I do think a lot of conservatives as well in this country, ultimately believe that the UK has a responsibility to adhere to our international obligations and protect people who are fleeing from danger and violence. I think that goes across the political spectrum, actually. Then you have, people who are a bit further on like me, who really believe that we need to open up mobility rights to more people. But I think that basic principle is very widely held in this country. That bill, the Nationality and Borders Act, absolutely tramples all over that principle. But one thing it didn't do, which was, as I said, it put this 6-month time limit. It said, we'll try to remove people, but if within 6 months we haven't managed to do that, then, they'll just go back into the asylum system as ever. So all that did was create a 6-month additional waiting time for people in the asylum system. Because, as you say, there was a huge backlash against the Rwanda proposal. The Rwandan government, at any rate, was never prepared to take in significant numbers of people, and certainly wasn't ready to start taking in significant numbers of people a year ago when the plan was announced. That was just an agreement on a piece of paper. We paid 120 million for it, but it was literally just a press release. So it hasn't happened, and in the meantime, people have been, traumatized. They've been threatened with this removal, and but eventually, after 6 months, the government has accepted, well, we can't remove you. So they've entered into the asylum system. And then the asylum system itself, well, we have deprioritized actually making decisions in the asylum system. So those people, even when they've moved through after the 6 months initial delay, have been finding that they wait for very, very long periods to receive a response to their claim. And that's what's built up this huge population of people now living in temporary accommodation in hotels. And it's a very clear additional bogeyman that the government has produced. They don't process people's claims. While people are waiting for their claims to be processed, they can't work, they can't settle down, they don't know if they can stay, they can't rejoin their family members, they can't study, they just can't get on with their life, they're trapped. So the government has moved them out of sort of community-based asylum seeker accommodation that we used to be using, and dumped them in hotels up and down the country, and just left them. And, people are not receiving an initial decision on their claim for over a year on average. So obviously this has created a huge amount of tension in local communities. You have suddenly, local hotels filled up with people who have no support whatsoever, who have no right to work, no right to settle, nothing. They're just dumped there and they wait, months and months and months on end. Obviously, it's a recipe for disaster. And I think that that's a deliberate decision, because they could perfectly well be processing those claims quickly and efficiently. They could be getting people through the system within a couple of months. There's no reason why they shouldn't. That's what they do in Germany, France. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are huge problems with their asylum systems in those countries too, but they do process people's claims and in a reasonable time frame. So that's meant that rather than solving the issue as we were promised, the Nationality and Borders Act just created more chaos. Which some of us may have predicted at the time.
Yeah, but it's like the hotel situation. Like now, there's there's been protests, quite big far right protests against these hotels. You see quite far right figures and even conservatives saying, they claim that the migrants, people that are inside these hotels, are like living in luxury. When, like you said, like these people have been dumped there for ages. I just can't imagine the stress. Like I've had times of my period in my life when I've been on the dole or whatever, and I've been nothing to do for weeks or whatever, and it's just. I obviously hadn't fled anywhere, didn't have any trauma in my life to deal with, and it was boring and horrible enough. But if you were these people stuck there, and now there's far right people claiming you're living in luxury, it's just crazy.
It's destructive to your mental health. I think if you're forced into inactivity for long periods, it's really, really damages people's sense of well-being, their sense of self, their sense of, and many of these people will be traumatized people who've escaped from horrific danger, and they may need support in order to get back into the labour market and to get back on their feet. But some of them, would benefit a huge amount from being able to actually start supporting themselves and start working. And we have huge labour shortages. I mean, this is an answer that, that there is an answer. The question answers itself of what we should be doing about this situation. But unfortunately, that wouldn't serve the government's agenda of creating this, huge backlash, this huge crisis, and so the refugees have been completely abandoned, and then that brings us to the current time when the crisis has only grown, and so we're given a new bill, and this time this one's supposed to be the solution, which obviously you can imagine how confident I am in that.
Yeah, so let's go on to this new bit. I mean, there's probably so much more we could say about the current situation before we move on, but let's move on. Let's start with the illegal migration bill. I think it was announced in like February, March time. It's quite recent, isn't it? And can you sum that up? What are some of the worst things, do you think, that are part of this illegal migration bill?
Yeah, so this bill is truly horrific. I tried to live my life as a migrants' rights campaigner, knowing that things can always get worse and that the government and the politicians can always dream up something worse. But this one is quite a shocker. It basically takes the idea of the Nationality and Borders Act that we were previously discussing and ramps it up to 150. So instead of saying, after 6 months, we'll try to remove you to another country if you come here to seek asylum. And after 6 months, if we can't do that, then we'll process your claim. It just says we just never will process your claim. So if you enter the UK through irregular means, you will never, ever obtain refugee protection. And I would like to emphasise, almost every asylum seeker, every refugee that we've ever protected in the UK, almost all of them enter the UK through irregular means, because there are very, very few ways for them to come through a regulated scheme. Very, very few people can come through that scheme. So around the world, all refugees basically travel irregularly because they, by definition, are escaping from persecution. They can't get their paperwork. And the basis of the Refugee Convention and international law is that states will take them in and hear their claim regardless of how they've travelled. So this bill says, we'll throw that out the window. And if you've travelled here through irregular means, you will never receive refugee protection in the UK. So we won't process your claims. So, of course, we'll have to lock you up and dump you in, more hotels. Except that there is a problem with the hotels. We're running out of room. They cost too much. So instead, we're going to dump you now into barracks or disused barges or just any sort of horrible sounding accommodation that we can possibly find. Anything that sounds like we're going to be really cruel about things, we'll try to put you there. And again, sort of obviously this having an impact on backlash from local communities that, don't want this. And I would say, that there is some horrible racism in some of that backlash. There's also just completely reasonable objections. I would object very strongly to a bunch of traumatized, rightless people being dumped into inadequate accommodation in my area and dumped there forever with no right to ever integrate, to work or anything else. And that is what this bill does, because if we never process their claim and we never give them any right to settlement in the UK, then they will live in limbo forever. Because realistically, we're just simply not going to send them all to Rwanda. That's just not going to happen. I do think it's possible that as many as maybe a few thousand people might eventually be sent there. I hope not, but it could happen. But it's not an outcome that's going to apply to, significant numbers of the people who come here and seek our help. So what they're going to do is they're going to end up in limbo forever. They're going to end up basically being really undocumented migrants. And then they're subject to the hostile environment, which is a set of rules that we've had in place since 2012, which means that if you live here without a status, you're not allowed to work. You're not allowed to access housing. You're not allowed to rent. You're not allowed to open a bank account. You're not allowed to get a driver's license. You're basically locked out of all the basic services of our society.
It's awful, right? Like they have to pay, if they use the NHS, they can only use very basic services, right? And they have to pay. I was reading something last night about it, and I think it's like it costs £7,000 if you're pregnant, if you're about to give birth, and you're an irregular migrant. It's just mad. It's absolutely mad. It's so horrible, and it's like that was brought in by Theresa May, who's kind of been whitewashed these days by some people, and that's something I always remind people. I remind people if they start talking about her as if she's some kind of hero. Yeah,
I think it's amazing how the conversation has shifted so much to make Theresa May look like she was reasonable in terms of migration. When, if your listeners know about the Windrush scandal, where a lot of people from the Windrush generation who came to the UK to rebuild the country after the war, they were targeted by this hostile environment, and they were subject to, these same restrictions, and many of them lost their jobs, many of them were wrongfully deported, wrongfully detained. That's the same system that is now going to apply to all refugees. And obviously, if you put people, dump them in a country for the long term and say you never have the right to work, obviously many of them will be forced to work to support themselves in the underground economy. And so what this will do, if I was a trafficker, or if I was a smuggler or an exploitative, abusive employer, this would be my absolute dream bill, because you create a population of people who are outside of the protection of the law, who have no right to work legally, so they cannot hold you to the standards of paying a minimum wage, decent hours, rests, decent conditions in the workplace, any kind of health and safety protections, anything like that. You can abuse them at will. And this bill, and this is some of the worst of it, it says very clearly that, for example, if those people are subjected to slavery and trafficking, so if they're forced into prostitution or forced into conditions of slavery at work, that they will not have recourse to our protections under the law for that. That is how extreme it is. And that is what a gift it is to traffickers, slavers, exploiters. The worst people in this country are being handed this population and said, we're not going to protect these people. Here they are. It's absolutely extraordinary. It's going to massively fuel criminality. And then, of course, there's the threat of the detention and the deportation. And that applies to men, women, and children. And it applies to them regardless of where they've come from. So the government likes to talk about these people, maybe they're not really refugees. We're talking about people from Afghanistan, a woman from Afghanistan, anyone who comes here irregularly, no matter how obviously they are a refugee, they will be subject to that protracted limbo, detention, and the threat of deportation to somewhere like Rwanda. And of course, that cannot happen without massive violence. So this is a charter for, massive exploitation and abuse to take place in our labour market, huge trafficking and slavery problems, plus enormous and severe violence towards this group of people, whether that be in detaining them, whether that be in trying to deport them. And I really, I think that the government has overestimated how much of a stomach for that kind of suffering even the most stereotypical right-wing red wall voter really has. I don't think this country wants that kind of cruelty and that kind of violence, but it really is that extreme what this bill does.
Yeah, it's really extreme. It is quite brutal, isn't it? And So yeah, you just mentioned red wall voters. For people not in the UK, basically there's an area in the UK, the north of England, and parts of the Midlands where I'm from, that used to vote Labour, and in the last election they kind of switched over to the Conservatives, right? And a lot of media attention is on those people, on Labour trying to win them back, and they tend to be typically like socially conservative people, right? Or the white working class, they're often called as well.
I just think, I mean, I do think, like, obviously, you know, this idea of the red wall voter, they're given so much attention. They're also, I think, flattened and stereotyped a lot. Obviously, not everybody in that area has sort of hateful views towards foreigners, or, you know, or even close to that. So, but I think in general, what this bill seeks to achieve, the illegal immigration bill, is something that would be abhorrent to most people up and down the country if they were told clearly what it does. I don't think people would agree with it, and obviously, people quite rightly have no confidence that it's going to work. There's no deterrence that you can give people that deters them from, you know, the hope for a decent life. Deterrence policies simply don't work. They don't work here. They've never worked here or elsewhere in Europe. They don't work. Record numbers of people crossed irregularly into the EU last year. The EU has incredibly brutal and the most brutal border policies that it's ever had towards refugees and asylum seekers. So clearly, you know, there is no relationship between how brutally you treat people and how many people are forced to come here. So this won't work, and I think it will disgust people. But unfortunately, the government is forcing it through Parliament on an extremely accelerated schedule. So there's no proper scrutiny of it. Our media is also, unfortunately, very bad at clearly explaining the contents of legislation that is passing through Parliament. So most people sort of are caught up in a debate. You know, it's like we were talking about at the beginning about the deficiencies of the media conversation. I caught up in a debate about, but aren't they all from Albania or something, rather than hearing the actual truth of what this bill is going to do. And while we're arguing about whether or not, you know, how many Albanians would be the right number, you know, these pieces of legislation pass and do enormous damage, and cause huge harm both to our communities and to refugees.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like you said, the red wall voters are really stereotyped, and it seems to be that's the focus of all the media and politicians is winning them, and like, you know, coming up with policies that they think will attract to this stereotype. I often think that this, you know, this, particularly with the Nationality and Borders Act and this new illegal migration bill, they proposed them, and Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, has basically said as much. She's not sure that this will actually be legal, right? I often think that they come up with these laws to win votes. It's not so much that they actually care about people coming in. I mean, obviously they might do somewhere, but yeah, do you think that's right? It feels like it's an electioneering thing to me rather than sane policy.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you on that. I think it's very clearly, especially this bill, is very clearly geared towards the election because, as you say, you know, basically there's a convention since 2010, the UK Equalities Act. Every new piece of legislation has to have a statement at the beginning from the minister who brings in that legislation that says, you know, that they have done a legal assessment and that they believe that this complies with the requirements. Sorry, not the Equalities Act, the Human Rights Act. You know, that this complies with the requirements of the Human Rights Act, and this bill does not. And the Home Secretary obviously received advice from lawyers saying, well, you can't say that this bill complies with our requirements under the Human Rights Act because it probably doesn't. So she's pushing through a bill that very clearly will be challenged in the courts, very clearly goes counter to many of our legal obligations to treat people fairly and with decency and with respect for their rights. And what the intention is, therefore, is not for what's stated in the bill to actually work, but it's to continue to have that fight, continue to let the numbers build up in these squalid conditions, in communities where it's totally inappropriate to host them, and to continue to be able to point the finger at lawyers and the courts and our basic human rights protections and say that's what's frustrating the process, so that they can come to the next election and say, actually, we need to withdraw, Brexit Mark II, we need to withdraw from human rights protections in order to be able to get rid of these foreigners. When in fact, actually, we don't need to do that at all. We need to adhere to them in a system that functions. And we've had that in the past. We've had that with greater numbers of asylum seekers coming here in the past, with an asylum system that was nominally basically functional, that processed claims and that let people who are refugees get on with their lives and rebuild them in our communities. And we could do that now. But instead, they're deliberately creating a situation where this is going to build up the pandemonium, the hatred, the hysteria, and the press is going to build up. There will be case after case where people will be prevented from being removed under this bill. And the government will go into the next election saying, well, that's why you need to vote for us, so that we can take you out of the protections of those courts. And therefore we can enact this program. And they're doing that because they've got nothing else to campaign on, really. I mean, everybody's shopping to feed their families has gone through the roof. There's human excrement flowing in every single one of our rivers. Every single part of the public sector is out on strike because conditions are so poor. There's record waiting times in our NHS and A&E departments. This government has completely failed us on every single measure. And that is why they're creating this crisis, in order to have something to campaign on at the next election. And it's all off the back of the most vulnerable people in the world, people who have fled persecution and danger. And it's truly reprehensible.
Yeah, it's bad. Like, the situation in this country is fucked. I often wonder, I hear it sometimes from people in Europe, but I wonder what must they think is going on here.
If there are people in Europe listening, well, they'll also know very well that their systems have their own problems, and they very much do. And I would say that, we are a basket case, and I wave sadly to your listeners in Europe and apologise for being British. But at the same time, I do think that this is part of an international system. There's been a race to the bottom. We just happen to be winning it at the moment. But standards of protection are incredibly poor across Europe, and the hostility towards migrants is extremely high. And I don't think that we'll fix the UK system without the systems across Europe being much better as well. So I think that we need to look at this internationally. And, Brexit or no Brexit, actually, we're still implicated in the migration systems of our neighbours.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, what they do affects us and what we do affects them, right? Yeah, and it's like, it does. You can tell we're coming up to I think there's election due next year or the year after. I think it's 2025 or 24 soon, and it feels like there's a wedge. It feels to me like the Conservative Party are coming a wedge, particularly with this kind of stuff, with their attacks on trans people, and this kind of, it's like a wedge issue to divide. Like, oh look, we're going to be tough on these crazy weird people, and the other side aren't. It's just awful. It's really a horrible time to be looking at politics.
It is depressing. It is depressing.
So, do you know much about this border that's going on? That there's this border stuff that they're trying to build or already have built in Calais, right? And in France, and they're trying to make more cooperation between the police or the gendarmes. I'm not quite sure what they're called in Calais. Do you know much about the situation there?
Yeah, so this is the most recent announcement was half a billion, was it? 500 million? Was it that much? It was that much.
We'll get it in the show notes. We'll check it. I'll get it right in there.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's £500 million that we're going to send over to the French, and that's the latest. I mean, only a year ago, Priti Patel went over there and signed off some lucrative deal for the French police, and the year before that it was her back again, and then we've had 7 Conservative Home Secretaries since the last time we had a different government, and every single one of them has gone over to France and signed a deal to give them money to patrol the border, and as you can tell, it's been massively successful every single time, and a really good way to spend our money. The absolute huge waste of money creates misery. I mean, the situation in northern France for migrants is absolutely horrific, and the police harass and abuse people, tearing down their tents, spraying them with pepper spray, families living in the mud. Between two of the world's richest countries in a border zone that is, they're treated like they don't matter, and like, who touched it last? It's an absurd and revolting game that we're playing between, passing the buck between France and the UK. But this latest tranche is just more of the same. And as I was saying, this idea that we can be cruel enough, that we can get the police, pay the French police to give migrants in Calais enough of a kicking that they'll disappear. It's just not realistic, and it's not what any of the evidence of human behaviour tells us. And yeah, I mean, the new part of this deal, I suppose, is that some of that money is going to go to building a new detention centre in France. Well, I mean, what difference will that make? The French already run detention centres, and just like us in the UK, the French cannot just round people up because they're inconveniently in Calais and lock them up. Thank God, because basic principles of justice and human rights still exist, and the French cannot deport these people either, because just like us, they are signed up to the international treaties that say you can't send somebody back to danger. So if you're an Afghan person in France, the French can't send you to Afghanistan any more than if you cross the Channel can we send that person to Afghanistan. And again, thank goodness that's the case. So us feeding money in to the French detention estate is just sending good money after bad. It's an absolute waste. That money should be spent on our communities, on a functioning asylum system. It's absurd. The French are laughing at us from that perspective, and it's not going to change anything. It's just going to be more cruelty, but it's not going to fix the issue. I think the international collaboration that we do need with the French is one that is centred around the principle of protecting human life, and of protecting the right for people to find protection in a context that recognises their agency. They're human beings. A lot more people seek asylum in France than seek asylum in the UK. The ones who want to come to the UK have reasons for that. And we need to have a system that respects those reasons. You or I, if we wanted to cross the Channel, we would get across on a ferry or on the train. The only reason why these people are forced to enrich smugglers and live in these terrible conditions and risk their lives in the Channel is because the French and UK governments refuse to give them the documentation that would allow them to take safe journeys. And that's all about creating this theatre of cruelty. It's not about fixing the issue, because ever since we put juxtaposed controls, the UK border that operates in France, that was 30 years ago now. There have been, I saw a piece of research that actually counted them out, but I know that it's at least 22 major agreements between the French and the UK since then, 30 years ago, that were intended to end the irregular crossings, end the destitution of migrants in northern France, or at least they were presented as the solution. This doesn't work. And until we have a population that is willing to say this doesn't work, people will always move. We need to accommodate that. We need to protect people. We need to invest in people. Then with this pantomime will continue, and it claims so many lives.
Yeah, it's bad, isn't it? Like the stop on the boats is this thing that they keep going on about. But like you said, there's very few other ways to get into the country, and that's something that Britons, I think, often forget, is even getting a tourist visa is really hard. In the previous stories I've worked on, I spoke to Brits who were married to non-EU citizens, and there was this one guy I spoke to who was married. I think his wife was Vietnamese. He couldn't even get a tourist visa to come here because they were like, if you come, you're going to claim asylum. And so it's really upsetting the whole situation is upsetting. But when you hear about people from Afghanistan who've this country has a debt to pay to them and a responsibility to people of that country, they can't even get here, and the only way they can get here is irregularly, right? Generally, yeah, it's exactly. Just and what's happening in Sudan now. There's a civil war. It looks like it's what's happening there. It's really sad. and people fleeing that situation. I think Sudan's a former British colony. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, British Egyptian Protectorate, whatever. It's a British colony.
Yeah, so it's going to have, they're going to have links to this country. They might speak English there. People might want to come here because they have family here and historical ties, etc. The only way to get here, I assume, I haven't looked.
You can make that assumption. It's pretty safe. There's absolutely no safe way for a Sudanese person to get to the UK. There's no way any visa would be approved from a Sudanese person applying to come here under the current circumstances. Because as you say, if there is a chance that somebody will claim asylum when they get here, we do not issue them visas even for visits. So yeah, there's nothing, and for Sudan, there's no other route. It's not like Sudanese people could all go to Germany or something. It's not like, there's absolutely no rich country that is offering serious solidarity and assistance to the people who are escaping unthinkable violence in Sudan. And so obviously they will flee through irregular means. And that's what humans do. We go from where we can't live to where we can live, and they will do it. And it's the only question that we have to ask ourselves is how cruel are we willing to be about that?
Yeah, it seems like this government is willing to go quite far.
Yeah.
So I think I'm just looking at my questions here. I think I've asked everything I wanted to ask about the illegal migration bill. Before we move on to another topic about humanitarian visas, if you're all right for time still.
Yeah, I can go a little bit longer.
Okay. Was there anything else you wanted to say about the illegal migration bill? I know we could talk about it forever, but was there was there anything else?
I think that was pretty good. Covered quite a lot of ground.
Well, it's really good. Thanks for talking to us about that, because I've wanted to get someone on to talk about this for a long time, and you're quite knowledgeable about it, so it's great to get you on. So let's talk about this this article you read that I thought was really interesting. I think it was it was an article that you wrote, didn't just read it, for Open Democracy, and you were talking about humanitarian visas. And so a lot of people are talking about, some people are talking about this is a way that we can get people who are genuine refugees, I suppose you could say. I don't know, why don't you explain what is a humanitarian visa and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, well, I'm really glad you liked that article. I think it's a really interesting issue. Basically, obviously, I'm sure your listeners will be hearing this conversation that we're having and saying, we need to provide people with safe routes to come here. And we absolutely do. And I totally don't disagree with that at all. What my article was trying to do was sort of tease out, okay, well, what are the proposals that exist from human rights defenders that talk about, providing a safe route for refugees to get here so that they don't have to take these dangerous journeys, they don't enrich the smugglers. And I looked at them, and one of them, full disclosure, that I discuss in that article, I actually was involved with thinking up. So that's surprise, the one I think is the strongest, but it has its problems as well. So to be fair, I critique myself as well. There's a lot of proposals that basically entail identifying particularly vulnerable people in a situation. Say we pick Sudan, right? We pick Sudan and we say, okay, well, the UN's operating in Sudan. They will be running some camps, some, immediately emergency relief for people who are escaping. They can identify some particularly vulnerable people and they can send them to the UK. And yeah, okay, sure. I mean, that makes sense. If people can apply for that would be a great way to protect some people. But realistically, most of the proposals dance on this pinhead that I was talking about earlier about, the acceptable realm of what we can talk about with refugee protection. And they say, so maybe we could, help a few thousand people that way, even maybe 20,000 people that way. And that would be amazing for those 20,000 people. But people know, looking at that doesn't solve the problem, does it? It doesn't solve the problem because there is a much greater need than that. And by focusing on this additional layer of extreme vulnerability, so we're not talking about just refugees who need protection because they've escaped from danger and persecution. We're talking about refugees who've fled from danger, who are also women or children, who are also disabled, who also have some additional needs. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying we shouldn't protect people who are in those circumstances. Obviously we should, and creating schemes to protect them specifically is very good, but it doesn't solve the issue, right? Because the issue is that all refugees are vulnerable. That's what a refugee is, right? And actually what the Refugee Convention does, as I was explaining earlier, is it protects the right for anybody who is escaping from danger to present themselves in a country and say, please protect me. And that person must have their claim assessed. And if they have fled danger, they are a refugee, then they must be protected. And that protects the right to take irregular journeys. So as long as the proposals for safe routes remain focused on, a capped number of, specifically vulnerable people from one country, they will never respond to the diversity of need. So Sudan, descending into civil war at the moment, how quickly can we set up a scheme of this kind? How targeted can it really be? How fast can we really protect people? In the meantime, where does everybody else go? It's a great thing and we should do it, but it isn't the solution. And that's what the point I was trying to make in that article, is that if we spend our time talking about safe routes within the narrow constraints of what is, supposedly allowed to us to talk about, which is a few thousand people, then we're not talking about a response that is, realistically on the scale that we need to. And so in the meantime, I think it's vitally important that we defend the right for anybody to have their asylum claim processed in the UK and to receive protection if they're a refugee, regardless of how they've travelled. And then obviously we could take that conversation much further, and I'd be thrilled to do that. And maybe another time I'll come onto your podcast and talk about that, because that's moving towards a world where mobility is really a lot freer, right? And where everybody has the option of travelling safely, and what that would mean and how we could move in that direction. But ultimately, that's not where the conversation is right now. And so when we talk about safe routes, while I'm not against them, I don't think that they are the solution to the issue. And I think that the real solution for the moment is protecting the rights of everybody, regardless of how they've travelled.
Yeah, and I like how you mentioned the Overton window in there as well, I think. And we talked about that before. Anyone who doesn't know what that means, I think it's an idea or a theory of where conversations kind of take place in the media. So in this country, we've had a lot, for 30 odd years, the Overton window has been pushed further and further to the right. So people who were once seen as beyond the pale, I know you're supposed to use that phrase, who were...
I don't know what phrase you'd use, yeah. But sort of views that would have been considered really, really extremist right-wing views about refugees. Yeah, they are now mainstream.
And then ideas like you might have seem as completely insane, like lefty crazy, living in a dream world type ideas, when they're not, right? And like you say, everyone has that basic right, and that is a right that we have to defend and need to bring up. So I think it's really important to talk about that and make sure that everyone knows that even we're a safe country. It doesn't feel like a war could happen, but it could. Something could happen. You have to flee for whatever reason. You have that right to claim asylum wherever, and you can get there however, right?
Absolutely, you can get there however, and whoever you are is important, because a lot of the conversation is also premised on, a lot of these people are men. And whenever I hear that, I think about my brothers. If this country did descend into dictatorship, descend into war, and me and my brothers fled, the idea that I would be considered valuable or truly vulnerable enough to deserve help, and that my brothers would be expected to die, I mean, that's horrifying to me. And I think everybody who's listening will have a brother, a son, a husband, a father. Being male does not remove you of your right to life. And it's absolutely absurd that it's our side that has to say that, men have rights too. They're human beings. Their skin is not impervious to bullets. They can be tortured. They can be, targeted for forced recruitment to militias. They can be... they can be subject to all sorts of horrific abuses, and they have every right to seek protection and every right to seek, a future with opportunity and with safety and with everything that we want for ourselves. Every single man, woman and child has the right to want that for themselves and to pursue it. And the idea, whenever we give ground on this vulnerability argument, I think we're really losing, the ultimate thing here, which is that all human beings have an equal right to life and to opportunity, and our world does not provide that, and so it's natural that people will move.
Absolutely, yeah. Some of the comments that I get, you get all kinds of horrible comments sometimes on the civil fleet posts on social media, and one of the things people often talk about is they're all, the far right will say, they're all military aged boys or military aged men. it's like, yeah, but that I think is part of a conspiracy where they think Muslims are going to come to Europe and overthrow the religion or whatever. But yeah, I'm glad you bring those points up. It is an issue, and it's it shouldn't have to be always just the vulnerable. It's everyone, whoever you are, has the human right to seek asylum.
And if you've escaped persecution and you have no country and no papers and no documents, you are vulnerable.
Yeah.
Even if you're 20 years old and a strong young man, you are very vulnerable. And so that's simply, we cannot exclude people on that basis. It would be completely wrong.
Well, I'm going to put the links to that article, and I think you've done a few others for Open Democracy, so I'll have links to those in the show notes, so anyone listening can go and check them out. So let's go on to the last question, my favourite question. How are you feeling about the future of everything, Zoe? With regard, not just everything, but in regards to migration, and what can we do to stop us? I feel like we're hurtling towards a complete dystopia at times. What can we do to avoid that?
Yeah, I mean, this is always the big question. And I think I couldn't do the job that I do if I didn't believe that things can be better. Now, I don't think we're headed in a good direction right now. But, when we were talking about the Overton window and what is considered reasonable to talk about, I think a lot of the proposed solutions or alternatives that we hear about, we know are insufficient. You hear about Labour being the alternative to this government and how they'd, make a better deal with the French is their big, sell on how they'd fix this. And we all know that won't fix it. Like, maybe they'd create some more safe routes and that would be great. But again, as I've said, won't fix it. So I think that a lot of people know that, and they know in their hearts they don't like this equality and this inequality, and they know in their hearts that they don't want to see people drowning and suffering trying to reach us, but they don't know how we can have a world that's different. And I think that what's so important is to understand and to keep having the conversation about how it's entirely possible to set the world up differently. There is no reason that we have to have people dying at our border. We've created those borders that make people die at them. So I'm not saying it's easy, but I think it's vital to remember that it's possible, and that we've been moving in the wrong direction for a while. That Brexit's part of that. If you look at the way the European Union is moving at the moment, it's part of that. But there are reasons to hope, and I come back to the opinion polls that show that people recognise that migrants make a huge contribution to our society, and that we need more of them, not less, really. And I look at how young people's attitudes towards foreigners are completely different to older people's attitudes on the whole. And I look at people's growing sensitization to the impacts of climate change and climate catastrophe, and how that's going to most likely force mass displacement in the coming decades. And mass displacement that simply you can't just tell people, well, stay home and burn, we have a border policy. It's not going to work. And that ultimately the realistic side is the side that wants to change this radically, right? And wants to create free ways for people to travel and to move and to set up lives in places that are livable around the world. That is the only realistic side. And I would urge people to remember that we're not the utopians here. We're not the people with mad ideas about how things could be that are impossible to enact. It's entirely possible to change this, but we need to speak up. And that means every single one of us, I'm fortunate enough to have a bit of a platform, but every single person has the opportunity to raise their voice. Never think that you don't have a duty to speak up. So, if you listen to a talk radio show, call in. You know how it's always awful people calling in and saying horrible things? Those are organised, groups that set up right-wing people to call in and to say horrible things. You can call into, you don't have to have all the answers. You just have to speak like a human and say, well, actually, I don't agree with this, and I think we can do things better, and I think we can do things differently. You can write to your MP. If they're a Tory, tell them, that this is not being done in your name. And if they're Labour, tell them that you expect some vision from them, of a humane world that doesn't punish people for being born in the wrong place. and speak up in every way you can. There's so many people who are doing good work on this. You know, we actually are the majority, the decent people who want equality and who want decent treatment of migrants and who want to protect refugees. Never believe that we're not. And if we demand change, we can achieve it. But it does involve everybody recognizing that they you know, if you stay quiet, then they will claim your support for the other side. So we really all do have a responsibility to speak up in whatever way we can. And I know that isn't easy, and I know that it feels like everything's against us right now. But these things, they come and go in power, and I think that we're coming up to an election where a lot of things can change. And we really need to hold the incoming government's feet to the fire on a more humane approach to this. And we need to keep promoting the humanity that actually exists in our communities, and the good contributions that migrants are making, the good relationships that we have with our neighbours who are migrants. We all know that that's true, who's listening to this. And so we just need to keep shouting it from the rooftops as much as we possibly can. And I absolutely believe that another world is possible and necessary, and it's going to be forced upon us one way or the other. So, you know, stand up and be counted is, I guess, my message.
No, that's good. That's good. That's what I think. That's what I hope this podcast does in some ways. It's good to link up, and I think it's good to have other people who are listening to this to know that you're not alone in thinking the things that you think, right? Something you said just reminds me of a quote that I really love by David Graeber, the late David Graeber, who said something like, the ultimate secret of the universe is that the world is something that we make, and we could easily make it different. Something along that. I'm paraphrasing, but such a great quote. And you said something you said.
And I love that quote.
The idea that it has to be like this is completely wrong. It's completely wrong.
Yeah.
We don't have to be like this at all. And people don't need to die just because they're Sudanese, while we live in safety. It just doesn't have to be that way.
Absolutely. Well, Zoe, that was a really great interview. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for coming on, and thanks for sharing the stuff that you've shared in the past of the Civil Fleet's work. It's really nice. Anyone listening, I will have links to your social media, but how can they follow you? How can they see your work?
Yeah, so I'm constantly tweeting. I should really tweet a bit less, but I tweet, and my handle is at Zoe Gardener, which is a hilarious French pun on my name. But if you search Zoe Gardener as well, I'll probably come up. But yeah, Jardiniere.
Great. Wonderful. And people could probably see you on TV every now and then talking about migration. I don't know how you managed to I saw the video of you talking to, is it Stephen Gullis or something, at MPs?
Oh God, yeah, Gullis.
I don't know how you, when you have to talk to
That
these...
one was great. It was, yeah.
I mean, it was in a parliamentary committee hearing, so I really had to keep it sort of professional. But I think that, he wasn't expecting that.
It was good. I would have gone absolutely... in that kind of situation, I would go to pieces and stutter and not be able to say anything. So you did an amazing job there. But anyway, that was so good. Thanks for doing that. Please keep doing that kind of stuff. And I'll be in touch.
Cheers, Ben. It was great to be on. And just send me through, when it's ready, and I'll share it all over the place as well.
Perfect. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ben. Bye.
All right. That was episode 38 of the Civil Fleet podcast. Can't believe I've done 38 of these. It's really cool to keep being able to do it. Thanks so much for everyone who's listening. Thanks to anyone who donates. That's amazing. And especially thanks to Zoe for coming on this episode and talking with us and bringing all the expertise that she has. The illegal immigration bill is absolutely wild, and I just cannot believe that this kind of legislation, these kind of laws could be passed in this country, but this is the situation that we're in. Anyway, like I said at the top of the show, if you like this podcast, you could donate to us, help us to keep platforming people, help us to keep the lights on and to keep running the Civil Fleet. The costs are quite small, and I have another job, I'm all right, but if you could donate, that would be ace. You can do that by going to ko-fi.com/civilfleet, and you could donate the cost of a coffee. I think it's like £3 on there. That's ko-fi.com/civilfleet. That's where you can donate if you like, or you can give us a review, share us around, that kind of thing really helps also. Check out the website also, civilfleet.com, and you can find lots of stuff. Although recently I haven't had the time to write anything on there although a lot has been happening in the Mediterranean and across Europe. Right, I think that's everything I need to say. I will see you next month with another episode. Have a good one, guys. See you later. Bye-bye.